Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the Global Service Location Index webinar. I'm Vidisha Suman. I'm a partner in the digital transformation practice here at Chicago and a co-author of GSLI report. I'm very excited to kick us off today, and I'm joined by my co-authors, Arjun Sethi and Joe Rodeva. Arjun is the head of our APAC region and has been an author for GSLI since its inception, I think, in the early 2000s. So without further ado, Arjun, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Vidisha, thanks so much. Greetings, everyone, and really appreciate all of the attendees. And I can see the numbers fast rising on this first webcast of ours. So welcome, and I hope it is an engaging dialogue and discussion. If you could go to the next page, maybe just setting the agenda of what we want to do today. I'm going to speak very briefly on the overall GSLI, its history and evolution, literally from the start, from when we started in 2003 to now in 2021. Give you a little bit of background of how we do the work, and then pass it on to three of our leading SMEs who are on the call today and will be introducing themselves as we speak, specifically on their overall point of view on the emergence of digital hubs in different industry sectors, and then pass it back to Vidisha and Joe to round it off and give you a little bit more detail in terms of the deep dive on the index itself. So we go to the next slide, just to anchor on GSLI and its history. Listen, as Vidisha said, the first location index we published was back in 2003, and I still recall when we did it. And at that point in time, really the most topical thing post the 2000 era was offshoring and outsourcing and the emergence of attractive offshore destinations, as many of you will recall. And at that point in time, we started with barely a handful of countries in our index. I think if I recall correctly, there were no more than 15. And the focus was on the emergence of these destinations and the ability to do work from low-cost areas. We then moved on to really giving a lot of weight to where is it that not only is the destination attractive, but there is also talented labor pool, whether it is in activities to do with technology or certainly in business processes. I think more pertinent to this conversation, we were a little bit ahead of our times. Back in 2014 itself, we had provided opinion about the emerging wave in automation, robotic process enabled transaction processing. And we had outlined that wave to many of our readers and audiences across the globe. And we began to put a lot of weight into where is it that not just the labor, but the inherent technology advancements can help do work cheaper, better, faster. And then more recently, with the work moving to distributed channels, including on the cloud, there has been significant effort from Kearney to inject what we call as a digital resonance score that I will speak to you about just in the next page. And we feel that this digital score is increasingly impacting the attractiveness of destinations. So if you were to make one more step forward, Joe, on the presentation, the Services Location Index looks at four dominant domains when we opine upon what is now nearly 45 countries in our index. There is a financial attractiveness score, which looks at overall cost attractiveness. There is a people and skills score, available labor pools that I spoke of. There is a business environment score, which includes things like connectivity of a country, and within it, what we would deem as tier 1, tier 2 cities. But equally, the prevailing underlying infrastructure, whether it is physical infrastructure or infrastructure that is available to protect and keep secure your assets. And then finally, in the last 3 years or so, we have included what we call as a digital resonance score that we feel has assumed a significant degree of importance in the new world order. And this looks at true digital skills, availability of a cyber and cyber-related regulatory environment, overall activity. When we say corporate activity, we mean investments through accelerators, through R&D hubs, and other emerging, digital concentrated situations by industry vertical, which we will speak about in a second, that really make individual countries and or clusters of countries suitable for a particular industry segment. And so literally 45, 47 different measures across these four categories. And we look at a variety of sources, certainly Kearney proprietary research, but then also a lot of published research that is out there in the public domain, and then otherwise available to Kearney goes into preparation of the GSLI and the index. So proud to present the findings to you. And with that, I will hand it back to Vidisha and our subject matter experts for today.
Thanks, Arjun. I may ask you a question before we move on. So from a corporate standpoint, as most of our audience today are leaders in their own right, trying to figure out location strategies for themselves, what's your perspective on how should they think about the location strategy for the future? It's a big capital investment. It's not a, let me decide I'll set up a hub today and it'll be done tomorrow. So any guidance on how to use this framework and the report for location strategy discussions?
Yeah, the location strategy, by the way, remains a very, very important question for almost all of our clients. Vidisha, thanks for the question. The way to think about this is a very holistic assessment on each of these parameters. We believe in a stepwise growth in locations, one hub at a time. And what we mean by a hub, we will talk about this, but one at a time. And then increasingly, we see the use of an ecosystems of partners and providers who can help you enter into what would otherwise, maybe even 3 years back, may not have been a logical choice of location. So as you said, it's a capital decision. It's not one to take lightly. And so the way to enter into it is increasingly, we are saying, with either third parties or with some alliance partners who have already, entered into some of these new destinations that we want to talk about.
Perfect. Thanks, Arjun. Now, before we move on to the next piece, let me give you a little bit of a brief on the 3 themes we'll be sharing with you, which is pertinent to our 2021 edition. The first one is the growing demand for digital capabilities across industries, and we have seen a particular uptick in select industries during the pandemic, and it's expected to grow further. We'll have our experts share their opinion on it. The second piece is, in response to this growing demand, there is an emergence of locations as digital hubs, and in some cases, more of a maturing of some locations, because it's not emerging now, but a lot more maturing of locations becoming prominent as digital hubs, supporting this increased demand for digital capabilities. And then the third piece, we'll end the session with our forward-looking outlook. Now, as Arjun said, back in 2019, the reason for introducing digital resonance as a dimension was to show that shift in how companies, as they think about their location strategies, are pivoting not just on financial attractiveness, but on broader holistic digital capabilities. So what does for the locations that are traditionally high in our index going forward? How should they think about strategies and positioning to continue to be at the top? So those are the 3 things we'll discuss today. And I'm going to start off with the first one around the demand side across industries. What you see on this graph here is the digital investment by each industry and also by technology trends. Now, 2 major themes on this. If you look at the traditionally digitally mature companies or industries like the high tech or the media and CPG industry, 30 to 50% growth is what we've been seeing in the last few years, and it continues to be consistent growth. But what's more interesting is agriculture, health, and manufacturing has seen almost 100% plus growth, with select technologies driving it, and even more growth driven by the pandemic, and expected to grow further in the next few years. Let me introduce to you now our 3 guest panelists who are experts in each of these industries. To the panelists, I have 3 questions for you. Number 1, your views on what is driving this trend and the future outlook for this industry. Second, if you can share some examples from your client conversations on how are they responding to this trend and to this expectation of higher demand. And three, if there's any particular location you see become more prominent in your conversations, if you can highlight that too, that'll be great. So let's start with agriculture. Bahij, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Thank you, Vidisha, and hi, everyone. My name is Bahij El Rayas, and as Vidisha mentioned, I work across the end-to-end food value chain. I'm very passionate about the whole topic of food security and also sustainability. I think as we start by your first question, Vidisha, what is driving this? I think we need to start before COVID and look at some of the big challenges in agriculture. We are expecting the demand and the population to keep on increasing. Feeding 10 billion by 2050 is absolutely a big challenge, especially that we're seeing a rise in middle class, and the consumers are shifting from a grain-based diet to a meat-based diet, which puts a lot of pressures on resources. In parallel, greenhouse emissions are basically increasingly rising, and agriculture is one of the main culprits for doing that. What happened in the pandemic is we started seeing weaknesses in the system, whether basically the reliance on global trade. And we've seen that initially with Asia, but now more so with also in India. We've had quite a bit of disruption in trade that we're seeing in agriculture coming out from India, notably shrimps in specific right now. We've seen that with lack of agility for some of agricultural players, and that resulted in huge amounts of waste. So if you recall, last year, the number of grains and crops that were piling up, and we've also seen labor being highly impacted. So it's not a surprise to see agriculture, one of the three sectors coming out. A huge shift towards automation and technology. Agtech as a sector is one of the most dominant and rising. And we see investment in three key areas, especially our clients. That's what they're looking into. One is productivity as a whole, which is everything from crop and biotechnology to advanced farm equipment and precision agriculture. The second key area is basically new farming, which is everything from aquaculture to plant-based and indoor farming. And that basically, if you look at the Netherlands as an example, they have been able to have one of the most productive agricultural markets with very limited land. And other economies like Singapore are basically now driving that even further, also as they look at their commitments for the next 10 years. And what you're able to do with very limited land is quite impressive. And then the last one is sustainability, and regenerative agriculture is a big theme that you're going to keep on hearing, especially as soil becomes more damaged from intensive agriculture. We've seen that as a major topic. And then Vidisha, you asked, just making sure I answer your question. As we look forward, where do we see some of the trends? We see a couple of things, big themes coming up. The first thing is moving away from siloed solutions, where there's a lot of on farming technology, etc., towards more integrated decision support for farmers. This is a big thing because that makes, and how do you simplify and facilitate their investment. And then the second thing, we see a massive convergence in value chains. So agriculture of tomorrow will be very different. And we see big brands coming in and investing in agriculture, so bypassing the whole value chain. When you think about digitization of farming or sustainability, this is not just on the farmer. This is also driven by consumers. So we see some of those happen.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Bahij. Todd, I'll hand it over to you if you can share your perspectives on the health industry.
Yeah, thanks, Vidisha. Bahij made a comment that I want to pick up on. Early in his remarks, he commented on the shift from plant-based to meat-based cultures, which in certain parts of the world may sound counter-trend, but I can appreciate globally that is the trend. It's also one of the trends for rise of health issues globally, and then the importance we're placing as a global society on the importance of preventive management of disease and chronic conditions. I say all that because, to your first question, Vidisha, on what's driving the rapid acceleration of digital in health, really there are a few key themes, and I'll tie it back to that comment in a moment. So first, consumerization. I think we see that generally. So around the world, people are getting more and more accustomed to digital technologies, and they're expecting that in their healthcare delivery as well. That's one driver leading to forces of digitalization. Two, connected with that is personalization. So we've been collecting an awful lot more data on individuals over time, and the tools are catching up, and they're getting easier and easier to use. And the bar has been rising. And so consequently, people are expecting more and more personal healthcare. We see it on the big science side, of course, with DNA kinds of personalization, right, and drug therapies that are very personalized to me as an individual. We also see it in the services that we're expecting. So I'm expecting and anticipating that my engagement with my healthcare provider or any provider takes advantage of all that can be known about me. Of course, in a less creepy way than could be imagined totally. But personalization is a key theme. Third, and maybe equally or more powerful in select markets, is the cost efficiency and budget constraints that are required. I'm here in the U.S. And the conversation in many mature markets, in the U.S. in particular, is that we can't afford the healthcare that we've got. And digital becomes one of the ways that we're seeking cost efficiencies and service improvements at the same time through the process. So if you look at this chart, some of the areas that are getting a lot of attention resonate. So for instance, you see AI and ML, and you see robots and drones, highlighted. If I just sort of package those together as automation, I think Bahij used the term productivity on that. We do see a lot of that. It's like I pointed to in the drivers. It's in large part in order to be able to drive some of the cost efficiencies. At the same time, it's also in order to be able to drive some of the personalization. There's also other trends going on in different markets, like demographics and the like. And so in some cases, along all the span of issues here, Vidisha, we see different technologies popping up in different parts of the world in order to account for whether it's a younger population or an older and aging population. But we do see a lot of that. You also asked about what's changed during the pandemic. I think most likely folks on the call can relate to experience they've had with telemedicine. I think that's been the big breakthrough on the services side of healthcare over the period of time. There are other ones for sure. We've seen, the rise of consumer-friendly places in order to get healthcare services. In the U.S., we talk a lot about pharmacies being the front door for vaccines nowadays. Of course, we've also seen a lot of heavy-duty science going on with vaccine research and the like, and we should expect that a lot of the technologies being talked about here will continue in that space. Consumers also, over this period of time, populations in general, have taken a greater interest in health and wellness. So we should expect that will continue during the pandemic they have, I should say. So we would expect that to be a trend continuing going forward. And then finally, Vidisha, you asked about sort of forward-looking aspects of this. Where we've seen most of the innovation occurring in the last few years has really been in the U.S. market as well as in China. That's not to say it doesn't occur in other markets, especially like European countries see, I think, large investments as it relates to big pharma in particular. But as you think about beyond just big pharma and overall healthcare, I would point to keep an eye on the U.S., keep an eye on China as places for the sort of the digital innovation. There is for sure lots of other parts of the world where we are moving routine aspects of healthcare where regulations will allow for it. That continues to be a trend. We continue to work on that with clients, but the bigger, more innovative digital investments are occurring in those two bigger markets. So hope that helps.
Thanks, Todd. I do have one question for you. As we think about digital in health, data and personal data, and there's a lot of regulation around it. Any guidance on, as companies are thinking about their digital hubs for healthcare in particular, how do you manage that?
Well, the conversation that typically is going on now is that the regulations are outdated in many of the markets. Right, there is a push beyond just health data. There is a push to protect, privacy of data. At the same time, we have pushes for personalization and population health kinds of metrics. With the best example we've ever seen in the history of the world is going on right in front of our eyes at the moment. There's a tension there for sure. The regulations will need to be rewritten to accommodate for that. So the guidance, I guess I'd say, is, be active in the conversation. Don't be passive and let it happen. If you're a larger company and have access to lobbyists and resources, use that in order to be able to participate in the conversation. But each society is going to have to work that out. And to be honest, it's way too complicated a topic in a few minutes to talk about globally. But it's
probably a topic for our next conversation. Doug, hand it over to you for manufacturing, and what are you seeing in that sector?
Yeah, sure. So Doug Mell, I'm a partner and spend most of my time in manufacturing. I lead our global manufacturing industry 4.0 service line as well. So answering the question on where we see the rapid acceleration of digital investment, I mean, manufacturing, when we look at it, it kind of cuts across all of these industries, right? So there's, I would say 3 major themes, and I think Bahij and Todd hit on some of these as well. So these are kind of common across industries. One is the kind of the shrinking of supply chains. So call it reshoring, domesticating. I think the pandemic has kind of brought a lot of that on, but also just broader tariffs, potential trade wars, disruptions, major disruptions in the supply shortages. If you think about the chip shortages today, if you think about some of the hyperinflation in lumber and steel and aluminum, some of the plastics, that's becoming problematic for a lot of companies, and they're rethinking their supply chains. And to do that, they have to domesticate a lot of times. If you think about the U.S., try to domesticate from a primarily Asian supply chain, you have to do so while keeping your cost competitive, right? And so to do that, that's where they're really tapping into digital technologies, I 4.0, we call it. You think about how better utilizing assets. So data to improve predictive maintenance, remote maintenance, better labor performance. We've got vision systems today that track operator movement. If you think about like an industrial engineer on steroids, right? I mean, these are some systems that can really kind of optimize and take the waste out, improve labor productivity. Even on the quality control side, if you think about the cameras and what they're able to do with continuous improvement with AI, be able to detect micro flaws, right, surface imperfections at high speeds and take them out, right, that a human eye could only do, and sometimes just with human kind of feeling and touching. So they're much more sophisticated. And then even like if you think about exoskeletons and what that's able to do from a workforce perspective and ergonomics, and reduce the loads on muscles and improve your overall workforce health. And then you go even into just better overall performance. You think about digital twins, and you're able to get the manufacturing right and kind of tweak on the fly in parallel without disrupting production. Plant performance transparency, right? You have all data and performance, OEEs, et cetera, right on your cell phone, right? For all of your plants around the world, if you think about the connected plant network. So very, very cool stuff there. The second, I think, is I think Bahij mentioned this, is increase in customization or personalization. So if you think about shorter batch sizes, more flexible tooling, additive manufacturing is playing a big role in that, both on the product side, but also the tool being able to print tools and fixtures kind of in real time, but also big data to understand needs and trends of consumers and be able to produce in unit lot size of one. And the third I'd say is just the reduced cost of technologies is changing the game and accelerating where companies are making their digital investments. I mean, you think about a simple case of a robot, right, from $100,000 several years ago, maybe 5-7 years ago, to approaching under $20,000 today. So that's a big change. Access and cost to mine data, right, has just fallen. So all these things are enablers and really kind of accelerating. I would say COVID, the pandemic, there's a couple of probably points here. The biggest one is the reliance on labor. So companies are rethinking how much they want to rely on labor. Labor availability has been a major issue, not just from contact tracing and people not being able to show up for work on any given day or moment. But also just the tightening of the labor force is making it really challenging for a lot of our clients. So they're rethinking, they're putting in place solutions like wearables, right, to enable contact tracing. That took off like crazy in the past 12 months. A lot of applications for cobots, right? Robots that interact with humans and in a very safe way, lower cost. So you just, for every robot you put in, on average, right, you take out 3.3 people, right? So if you're able to create flexible manufacturing environments with reduced dependence on labor, it's a win-win. And then I think just on the labor part and just the ability to ramp up training quickly with augmented reality, training aids, advanced analytics to reduce turnover and things like that. So that's been a big push, as well as I would say that the other big push or acceleration from COVID has been supplier transparency. Really trying to get transparency into the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 supply base to understand where your risks are, so you can mitigate those early and design a supply chain that's more resilient.
Thank you, Doug, and thanks, Todd and Bahij, for sharing your thoughts. Quick note for the participants: if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A feature on WebEx, and we'll be taking questions towards the end, as many as we can. Now, with that context of the demand side on where we're seeing an influx of investment and why it's happening, I'm going to move on to our next theme, which is the emergence and maturing of select countries as hubs. So, Joe, 2 questions for you. One is, help us understand what is a digital hub, why hub? And second, if you can highlight which countries are actually winning or emerging as winners in this accelerated focus on digital.
Sure, great. Thanks, Vidisha. So when we talk about, well, what do we mean by a digital hub? We're really talking about a country or location that really is has the right combination of there's a big amount of demand, there's government support, and a readily available talent pool to provide the right skills and labor to deliver on that demand for services and digital technology. And so what we've seen, and I think Vidisha earlier you talked about, some markets are maturing and continuing to grow, and we're also starting to see some markets emerge as well. And so when we look here over the last 4 years, we've seen some mature markets. We look at the top 5 by digital investment. There's a lot of consistency across the top when we look at United States, UK, China, and others. But we're also starting to see some fastest five growing or challengers in the market really jump up here. So just a couple I'd like to highlight more from the fastest five, if you will. One is Australia. So Australia has traditionally been really big on the fintech space, but there's been a really big growth in the ag tech space as well over the last few years. One example is that there's been a relatively new VC fund launched there called Tenacious Ventures that solely focuses on food and agriculture related startups. And so Australia is actually one of the 10 new countries to the GSLI this year. And so the rapid ramp up here on digital residence and investment is part of why we've added them for this edition. Another country I'd like to highlight is Sweden, also new to GSLI this year. On the same vein as Australia, Sweden is very startup friendly. They've got a great business climate and actually has produced the most technology unicorns outside of Silicon Valley across the globe. Spotify is a really great example of that. Next, I'd like to highlight Israel. So Israel has been a hub for research and development for a long time, but we've seen a rapid uptick in investments in Israeli startups across all industry sectors. It increased by more than 50% last year, but we've seen big spikes in agriculture and other sectors as well. And then just on top of that, there have been some big technology companies, Microsoft, Samsung, and others have all continued to grow their established R&D centers here in Israel. If we move a little bit to a cooler climate, I know the United Kingdom is featured both in the top 5 and fastest growing in some areas. The UK has actually seen a big acceleration in the opening of new businesses during the pandemic. And so actually in the first 9 months of 2020, the rate of new businesses opening increased 10% faster than the same period in 2019. And so there's been a lot of movement there in the health, manufacturing, and media space. And then lastly, I also just wanted to move over to Asia and talk a little bit about Singapore for a moment. So Singapore has very quickly become one of Asia's leading technology hotspots. Large American technology companies like Google, Amazon, Facebook, et cetera, have had hubs there for an extended period of time. We're also starting to see some larger Chinese firms open regional hubs there as well, like Alibaba. So I think with that, if we look back at the last year, we've all been working from home for an extended period of time. And so with this shift towards remote work from home, or work from anywhere, we've all become a lot more globally connected, but also globally dispersed at the same time. And so when we look at digital resonance, it's not just about startup investment. There are other factors at play here that really make a market really attractive as a digital hub. And so having that underlying infrastructure and connectivity is really important. And so if we go to the next page and just spend a few moments here on digital resonance, right? Like it's important to look beyond just investment when you look at how attractive a country is. So it's also important to look at, well, do we have the right skills and the right population? Do we have the right cybersecurity policies, rules, regulations? Does our business environment have the right support for digital business models? And how do we protect those outputs and assets? And so when we look at these maturing, emerging markets, this is really becoming a more important part of the decision-making process. And so when we look at the list here in the top 25, there's really 3 big themes. So one is these maturing markets are continuing to mature and leverage the past investments. So we see countries with digital resonance scores like the US, Western Europe, South Korea, Japan. But we also see countries that have a rich amount of investment and are emerging in this area as well. So when we look at countries like Indonesia, Indonesia has been a strong performer on the GSLI for a very long time, but relative to 2019, they rose 4 spots, primarily due to the uptick in corporate activity or investment. And so one other country I'd like to quickly highlight in this category is India. So India has been the top-rated country in the GSLI for, I think, the last 4 or 5 editions. And so I think that this is where India is really strong on corporate activity, but there is a bit of a demand shortage in terms of the skill sets. So there's India is really leading in the ITO BPO piece, but there is a observable challenge here from the digital skills pool in terms of the demand is far outweighing the supply. And then last but not least, I just wanted to highlight there are a couple of outlier countries. And so you'll see towards the bottom of the top 25, you see Mauritius. And so Mauritius compared to 2019 has seen a big influx in corporate activity and investments. And so that's helped rocket them up into the top 25. And in the past, and I think that investment has followed the availability of skills and good legal adaptability and regulations in that space. So I think with that, Vidisha, I can pass it back to you.
Thanks, Joe. And before we go to the next theme, one thing I wanted to highlight. So what you see on the screen is our digital resilience dimension, which is one of the dimensions in GSLI. The other pieces are financial attractiveness, business environment, and people skills and availability. The reason we introduced this in 2019, the last edition of GSLI, was, as Arjun noted earlier, we are seeing this shift towards digital hubs and digital capabilities outside of just pure IT and a pure offshore kind of a setup. So what we wanted to do in this edition, and if you can move, Joe, to the next page, we have developed a forward-looking outlook. So what happens if digital resonance becomes a prominent factor in your location strategies versus where it is today, where financial attractiveness is still the most dominant with 35% weightage? The way to read the graph is the left-hand side column is our current 2021 overall GSLI ranking, where digital is one of the dimensions. So India, China, Malaysia, Indonesia are the top 4. In the forward scenario where digital becomes more prominent, there are 2 big trends that you'll see here. Number 1, the more digitally advanced or affluent nations had formerly lagged in GSLI have risen to the top 10. You heard Joe speak about Singapore, Sweden, Netherlands, Germany, France, Israel. They're all moving to the top 10, and you can see that with the rank increase that's been highlighted on the second column. The important thing to highlight here is while these countries will continue to remain prominent in any considerations of digital hubs, they may not win on a pure financial perspective, but what we are seeing and what we are expecting to see a lot more of in the future is increased government intervention to position these locations more as centers of advanced R&D and innovation. So it may not necessarily just be a service location, but more of your R&D and innovation hubs because of the availability of talent and the infrastructure surrounding digital capabilities. We'll continue to see this dominance going forward as well. Joe spoke about Israel. If you look at the right-hand side column, Israel jumps almost like 40 points to get to the top 10 in the forward scenario. The investments in Israeli startups spiked to 1.44 billion in January of this year, which is almost 50% more than last year. And there is the huge demand, and you might have heard about this concept or the nomenclature of startup cluster on Silicon Valley. So there's a lot happening in Israel that has shown this prominence of moving almost like 40 or 43 spots in the forward-looking scenario. Now, in the same zone, if you look at Egypt and UAE, in the traditional and current methodology, both of them have made it to the top 25 and been prominent there as financially attractive locations as well. What has helped both of these locations is one is competitive compensation and infrastructure costs. Second is you've seen a strong entrepreneurial culture. And third is the willingness of the public sector to make strategic investments. For example, the Digital Egypt initiative by the Egyptian government has yielded very good returns, with quite a few tech companies, including Ericsson, setting up their digital hubs in Cairo to produce more cognitive software for global markets. But in the forward-looking scenario, they lose a few spots as well. UAE gains actually 4 spots because of their investments in digital and digital as a capability. Now, the other big theme here, and which should be a call for action, is for the traditionally high-ranked locations like India, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam, they move in the forward-looking scenario by almost 10 or more spots. Now, this forward-looking scenario is supposed to be provocative, but this is not 10 years out. This is going to be real in the next 2 to 3 to 5 years. So it's very important for the traditionally attractive locations to start thinking about what do we need to do different. And it goes beyond just startup activity or influx of investment. What is critical here is, I'll highlight 2 or 3 points. Number one is the importance of investing in both human and digital infrastructure. So human infrastructure in terms of skills and capabilities, talent, and continuous investment in that area beyond just the academics. Digital infrastructure focuses on the connectivity to pretty much the last mile. So you can have the availability of that talent and availability of collaboration across multiple geospatial locations within these hubs that allows you to grow even further beyond just 2 or 3 cities or centers within a country. The second piece is increased collaboration between public and private entities, and also a little bit between local and global entrepreneurs to help bridge the gap. Now, we've seen some good government intervention programs in select countries, like the My Digital Blueprint program in Malaysia. There's a Making Indonesia 4.0 roadmap that is also critical in this particular domain. And India's National Skill Development Corporation that is focusing not just on public-private collaboration, but also initiating pathways for international mobility and increased participation of women in the digital labor workforce. So all of these are good indications of government intervention, but one thing that is still maturing, I wouldn't say it's absent, but needs a lot more focus, is the availability of legal and protective infrastructure, particularly related to cybersecurity, privacy, and IP protection. And you've heard from our experts the importance of data sharing on the one hand, but being more critical and pervasive about privacy of data and the security of the data that's being shared across locations. So as you think about setting hubs and a network of these hubs versus just one center, the importance of guidelines, policies, or maybe regulations in this space is going to be super critical. So we are very hopeful that in the next edition of GSLI, we'll see changes in how these traditionally higher ranked countries are looking at it. Now, whether they remain to do so and whether they remain to stay at the top would be remains to be seen. So we'll see what happens in the next edition of GSLI. But at this stage, what's important is for each of these countries to take this as a very critical call to action, and the action needs to happen now versus waiting for the next 3 to 5 years, hoping that things will continue to remain as they are. Now, with that, I'm going to close it out from our side as panelists, and we'll open up for Q&A. There are some questions we've already had prior to the session as well. So, Joe, I'll hand it over to you to guide us through the Q&A session.
Sure, great. Okay, so I'd just like to remind everybody you're welcome to submit questions through the chat function on WebEx. So we'll be able to catch those there, and we can quickly jump to the first question here. So the first one I wanted to ask, I think Vidisha, is for you. So when we talk about digital hubs, is how are digital hubs going to be different or are different from traditional technology services?
Yeah, that's a good question, Joe. There's quite a lot of difference, but the one main piece is a change in how you look at digital hub as a profit center versus just a cost center, which has traditionally been the setup for technology service centers. We are seeing increasingly firms looking at these hubs as more profit generating capabilities versus just a cost center. And in order to position yourself as a profit center, there are two things that are critical. One, we all know the availability of skills and talent and capability is critical to even set it up, but it shouldn't be limited to just availability. There is a lot more focus on people as your core asset for differentiation. So talent management and talent retention as well as talent uplift strategies are very critical and should be a core focus for you as you set up your digital hubs versus just keeping it as I've set it a hub, I have the talent available, and then it should be a rolling motion. And as you know, in digital, skills and capabilities and the expectation from the industry keeps evolving in every 2 to 3 or 5 years. So you have to constantly invest in talent to maintain yourself as a digital hub. And then the third piece is more on the ways of working. What you've seen when we talk of digital versus a pure traditional IT kind of a setup, there is a lot more collaboration and closeness to the business and how you do the work. That would require investments in the right tools and infrastructure that allows you to collaborate, not just within your teams, but across teams, across hubs, and also with your external ecosystem partners. So I would say all three of these are very critical, but the most important piece is when you're setting up a digital hub, don't think of it as a cost center.
All right, great, thank you. All right, so our next question here, I think we'll go to our panelists. So I know Todd, you talked a little bit about locations gaining prominence in health space, but maybe Bahij or Doug, would you like to comment on what you're seeing in your respective sectors? Bahij, we can start with you.
Sure, yes. So what we're seeing is, especially after the pandemic, we're seeing major Western countries realize the whole topic of shorter supply chains and food security is no longer, is basically right now a matter of national security. And we're seeing a lot of money going into that. So especially in the European Union, you see a lot of funding going into that. And really trying to actually push the topic forward. So in terms of country, I'm not surprised. Countries like the UK, are making it up into the ranking. Netherlands have always been a leader in terms of agriculture and productivity. The other thing is basically Singapore is another really interesting location. Specifically with their aspiration to be sustainable, fully sustainable. And when you look at their size and location, it's an ambitious target and really requires them to adopt the technologies and the regulation. And no surprise to see them, adopting and embedding, cell-based agriculture for meat, right? Cell-based meat. Which is they're at the leading front from a regulatory perspective, and everyone is looking at them to see how it's gonna succeed and whether they're gonna scale that up as well.
All right, thanks, Bahij.
Yeah, I would just echo it. I think that across manufacturing, it's the similar theme: shorter supply chains, right, which is driving domestication of manufacturing bases, right? So you're seeing more of a migration to the historically higher cost countries, right? As we kind of migrate away from the traditional lower cost countries, and with that is enabling or driving a kind of step change in digital technologies to make it competitive. Try to improve the asset and labor utilization. So that's what we're seeing across manufacturing more broadly.
All right, thanks, Doug. So our next question is for Arjun. So I know we touched a little bit about location strategy earlier in the session, but given the worsening situation in terms of the spread of COVID across the globe, when we think about variants in places like India, Brazil, South Africa, how should companies think about these scenarios in the near and medium term?
Yeah, I think these scenarios remain pertinent, as I said even earlier to the question that Vidisha had raised. These remain very pertinent going forward because we have, if you notice that the score and the way it has morphed, our own perspective has changed and evolved through the digital resonance score. And we are not just looking at it from a labor arbitrage or a destination arbitrage perspective anymore. We are looking at it from the perspective of digital enablement, which is the key force that is going to drive some of these choices going forward. A lot of it is also driven by the investments corporates and governments in those locations are making into those sectors. So very, very pertinent. While we are in the pandemic situation, of course, we don't expect sort of boots on streets, but physical location as well as physical proximity interlinked with sort of a distributed way of working still remains very pertinent. And I see this study and our analysis to be top of mind for almost all of our clients.
Arjun, if I may add like a corollary to that question, and the last point you mentioned around work from anywhere, what we're calling as digital nomads in our study as well. So most of the investment from the countries have been on tier 1 or tier 2 cities, if I speak about the Southeast Asian countries in particular. So is there anything specific that they should be thinking about in last mile connectivity or getting everybody connected to enable that digital nomad setup to flourish and enable the countries to be positioned?
Yeah, Vidisha, it's true even for us at Kearney. As you well know, we are at this point in time literally in many of the locations, especially in Asia, which is very significantly being hit. We are actually providing infrastructure support, whether it is Wi-Fi connectivity or work at home terminals, even to the extent of ergonomic seating at home. We are providing funding to our employees for that. So increasingly, it is as opposed to a unit of 5,000 in a large software park, it is planning for a unit of one chair in one home and connecting all of them across. And how do you make that unit of one comfortable? That has become a key topic of discussion, and we are dealing with it ourselves. And I wouldn't say that everyone has solved it. It's sort of an active problem that we are talking about. Some of it is around funding and connectivity from a physical perspective, but there is an emotional connectivity of that workforce as well that we all need to give a lot of attention to.
Thank you.
All right.
Do we have any other questions,
All right.
Joe?
Well, so we currently we don't have any net new questions here in the queue, but I'll ask one more. So when we talk about the forward-looking view on GSLI, Arjun, we'll pose this one to you again: is can we still use the Global Services Location Index for BPO or ITO decision making, or is this going to transition to being more digitally focused?
We can certainly use it for BPO and ITO, but I see the digital resonance score continuing to have a larger weightage in our scores, and it will continue to morph. And so I would not be surprised if some of our traditional, highly ranked and rated locations sort of change. And, there is provocation and there is challenge to each one of them to maintain their leadership positions as new countries emerge as well. So can still be used, but it will evolve with the realities on the ground.
That's perfect. I think, Joe, if we don't have any other questions, let me wrap up now. We are at the top of the hour. To all the participants, thank you for joining. We have recorded the session, and in case if you want to share it with your broader network, we'll be sharing with you offline. The report is available on our website. If you have not been able to read it, there's a lot more content to it behind what we shared in the smaller graphs here. So let's make sure we stay connected. If you have any other questions for the panelists or for any, please feel free to reach out to us through the mechanisms available from our marketing team. So again, thank you for joining. To all the global participants as well. It might be a little bit late for you, and we'll hopefully connect again with the next edition. Thank you.